Deep in the shadows of history, a haunting enigma lies buried. It is a story that has puzzled investigators for generations. It has haunted a family for decades. This true mystery delves into the very heart of fear, loss, and the unknown. It whispers through the dense, dark forests of West Virginia, a tale of disappearance that remains unsolved to this day. The air grows cold when the story is told. It is a chilling account that begins on a festive night, only to descend into a nightmare from which there has been no awakening. This is the story of the Sodder children, a narrative so profoundly unsettling it challenges our sense of resolution and justice. Imagine a cold winter's night. The wind howls through the ancient Appalachian Mountains, carrying with it secrets long forgotten by the modern world. In this remote landscape, where communities are tight-knit and strangers are noticed, a single event can ripple through time, becoming a legend whispered from one generation to the next. The story of the Sodder family is one such legend, a dark stain on the local history of Fayetteville. It is a tale that begins with the warmth of a family home, filled with the laughter of children, only to be consumed by an inferno that left behind more questions than answers, more mystery than closure. The mystery is not merely about a fire or a tragic accident. It is about what came after. It is about the strange occurrences, the conflicting evidence, and the persistent feeling that something was terribly wrong. This story is a labyrinth of clues that lead nowhere, of hopes that were systematically crushed, and of a family's undying belief that the official narrative was a lie. The questions that arose in the immediate aftermath of the tragedy have never been answered. They linger in the air like smoke, refusing to dissipate with the passage of time, clinging to the memory of a family shattered by an inexplicable event. As we delve into this chilling tale, we must prepare ourselves to confront the unsettling nature of the unknown. We will walk through the ashes of a home and the fragments of a family's life, searching for clues that have eluded so many before us. This is more than just a historical case. It is a profound human drama that explores the depths of parental love and the torment of uncertainty. The story of the Sodder children forces us to ask a terrifying question. What happens when the truth is not just hidden, but seemingly erased from existence, leaving only a void of endless speculation? The Sodder family was the picture of American life in the 1940s. George and Jennie Sodder, immigrants who had built a life for themselves from the ground up, presided over a bustling and happy household. They lived with their 10 children in a small 2-story timber house in the rural town of Fayetteville, West Virginia. Their lives were filled with the simple joys and challenges of raising a large family in a close-knit community. Photographs from the era show smiling faces, a testament to the warmth and love that defined their home. They were known to be a good, hard-working family, respected by their neighbors and active in their community. On the night of December 24th, 1945, this idyllic picture was shattered forever. The family was celebrating Christmas Eve, a time of joy and anticipation. The older children, allowed to stay up late, were excited about the gifts they would soon receive. But as the night wore on, their lives were turned upside down by a horrific tragedy that would leave an indelible mark, not just on their family, but on the entire community. A fire, sudden and violent, erupted in their home, turning a night of celebration into a desperate fight for survival. The events of that single night would set in motion a mystery that continues to perplex and horrify people to this day. The fire was a devastating event, but what followed was even more disturbing. In the chaos of the blaze, George and Jennie managed to escape with 4 of their children. Their oldest son, Joe, was away serving in the military. But 5 of their children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny and Betty, were left behind, trapped on the upper floor of the rapidly burning house. The parents' frantic efforts to rescue them were thwarted at every turn. Their ladder was missing, their water barrels were frozen solid, their trucks wouldn't start. It was as if some malevolent force was conspiring against them, ensuring that the children could not be saved. When the flames finally died down, the house was nothing more than a smouldering ruin. The community rallied around the grieving Sodder family, offering condolences for their terrible loss. The official conclusion was swift and simple. The 5 missing children had tragically perished in the fire. Their bodies, it was claimed, had been completely incinerated in the intense heat. But as the initial shock gave way to a cold, creeping dread, George and Jennie Sodder began to question this official explanation. They could not accept that their children were gone, and a terrible suspicion began to take root in their hearts, a suspicion that the fire was not an accident and that their children were not dead. The night of the fire began with the comforting rituals of Christmas Eve. The Sodder home was alive with the sounds of a large, happy family. The younger children had gone to bed, dreaming of the morning to come. The older ones, Morris, Martha, Louis, Jenny and Betty, had begged their mother to let them stay up a little later to play with new toys that their sister Marion had bought for them. Jennie Sodder, tired from the day's preparations, agreed and went to bed herself, reminding them to close the barn and feed the cows before they turned in for the night. The last time she saw them, they were alive and happy, their laughter filling the cozy home. The peace was shattered shortly after midnight. Jenny was awakened by the ringing of the telephone. When she answered, a woman on the other end asked for a name she did not recognize. Jenny dismissed it as a wrong number and went back to sleep, but she was soon awakened again, this time by a strange sound, a loud thud on the roof, followed by a rolling noise. Around 1:30 a.m. she awoke for a third time, smelling smoke. The house was on fire. In an instant, the joyful sounds of Christmas Eve transformed into screams of terror as the family scrambled to escape the rapidly spreading flames. George and Jenny, along with 4 of their children, John, George Jr., Marion and Sylvia, fled the burning house. But their relief quickly turned to sheer panic when they realized that 5 of their children were still trapped in the attic bedrooms. George smashed a window to re-enter the house, but the staircase was already a wall of fire. He rushed outside, intending to use his large ladder to climb to the attic windows, but the ladder, which was always kept in the same spot against the side of the house, was inexplicably missing. His desperate attempts to find it in the darkness were futile. Every attempt to rescue the children was met with a strange and maddening obstacle. George tried to drive his 2 coal trucks up to the house to climb on top of them, but neither truck would start, despite having worked perfectly the day before. The family's water barrels, which they could have used to douse the flames, were frozen solid. Phone lines were down, and a neighbour had to drive into town to alert the fire department. By the time help arrived, it was far too late. The family home, which had once been filled with so much life and love, was reduced to a heap of smouldering ashes. In the cold light of Christmas morning, the full scope of the tragedy became apparent. The Sodder family home was gone, and 5 of their children were missing, presumed dead. Fire Chief F.J. Morris arrived on the scene hours after the fire had been extinguished. His crew conducted a cursory search of the basement rubble, but reported finding no bones, no flesh, no trace of human remains. This was the first of many strange details that would fuel the family's suspicions. The official explanation was that the fire had been hot enough to completely cremate the bodies, a conclusion that George and Jenny found impossible to believe. Doubt began to creep into the minds of George and Jenny almost immediately. George, who had driven a bulldozer over the site to create a memorial garden for his children, was haunted by the lack of physical evidence. He spoke with a crematorium employee who confirmed his fears. Human bones would have survived even a 2-hour cremation at 2,000 degrees. The Sodder house fire had lasted only 45 minutes. How could 5 children have vanished without leaving a single trace? This question became the driving force behind a lifelong quest for answers, a quest that would unearth a series of disturbing clues and unsettling theories. The Sodders' personal investigation began to uncover a web of strange events leading up to the fire. George recalled a travelling insurance salesman who had become angry and threatening when George declined to buy a policy, warning him that his house would go up in smoke and his children would be destroyed. He also remembered a stranger who had been lurking around their property. watching the children as they came home from school. More disturbingly, a telephone repairman informed them that their phone lines had not been burned through in the fire, but had been deliberately cut. As the days turned into weeks, the official story seemed less and less plausible. The family began to believe that the fire had been a deliberate act of arson, a cover for a far more sinister crime, the kidnapping of their children. They were convinced that Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny and Betty had been taken from the home before the fire was set. This belief would set them on a relentless, decades-long search for the truth. They refused to accept that their children were dead, and they would spend the rest of their lives chasing shadows, following faint leads, and holding on to the hope that one day their family would be whole again. George Sodder was a man forged by resilience and ambition, an immigrant who had journeyed from his native Sardinia, Italy, to the United States in 1908 at the young age of 13. He arrived with an older brother who soon returned to their homeland, leaving young Giorgio Sodder, as he was then known, to carve out a future for himself in a new and unfamiliar country. He found his way to the bustling rail yards of Pennsylvania, carrying water for the workers, before eventually settling in the rugged landscape of West Virginia. It was here that he transformed himself, anglicizing his name to George Sodder and building a successful trucking business from the ground up, hauling dirt for construction and later coal from the region's abundant mines. His life took a turn towards domestic stability when he met Jennie Cipriani, a fellow Italian immigrant whose father ran a small shop in the town of Smithers. Jennie was a woman of quiet strength and deep devotion, a perfect counterpart to George's more outspoken and sometimes fiery personality. They married and soon began to build not just a business, but a large and vibrant family. They eventually settled in Fayetteville, a town that was, at the time, home to a significant and thriving Italian-American community. The Sodders were a testament to the American dream, a family that had overcome the challenges of immigration to build a prosperous and respected life in their adopted home. Their home, a large two-story timber frame house, stood on a plot of land just outside the main town, nestled along the highway. It was more than just a building. It was the heart of their world, a place George and Jennie had filled with the constant energy and laughter of their children. They were known throughout Fayetteville as a hard-working and upstanding family. George was respected for his business acumen and his strong opinions, while Jennie was admired for her dedication to her home and her 10 children. Together, they created a sanctuary, a bustling hub of family life that seemed, for a time, to be protected from the harsher realities of the world outside. However, George Sodder was not a man who shied away from expressing his views, a trait that may have set him apart in the tightly woven social fabric of his community. He held strong, often critical opinions about Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator of his native Italy. In a community with many fellow Italian immigrants, such outspoken political views were not always welcomed. While many saw him simply as a successful family man, his candid nature and anti-Mussolini sentiments were a source of friction for some. This undercurrent of political disagreement would later be scrutinized, examined as a possible motive for the unimaginable tragedy that was to befall his family, turning their American dream into a waking nightmare. The Sodder household was a world unto itself, teeming with the chaotic and joyful energy that only a family with 10 children can generate. By 1945, 9 of their 10 children lived at home. John, who was 23, Marion, 17, George Jr., 16, Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jenny, 8, Betty, 5, and the youngest, Sylvia, just 2 years old. The eldest son, Joe, who was 21, was away from home, serving his country in the United States Army during World War II. The remaining 9 children filled the 2-story house with a constant symphony of activity, from the oldest who helped with chores and looked after the younger ones, to the little ones whose playtime antics echoed through the rooms and the yard outside. Life in the Sodder home was structured yet loving, guided by the firm but fair hands of George and Jennie. The older children were responsible and mature for their ages. Marion, the eldest daughter at home, was a source of help and comfort for her mother, often taking on a maternal role with her younger siblings. John and George Jr., the teenage boys, were already learning the ropes of their father's trucking business, their days filled with school and hard work. The middle children, Maurice, Martha and Louis, were at an age of discovery, navigating school, friendships and the daily adventures that their rural surroundings provided. They were known as good, well-behaved children, a credit to their parents. The youngest of the Sodder clan, Jennie, Betty and Sylvia, were the darlings of the family, their innocent world revolving around simple pleasures. They played with dolls, chased each other through the fields, and eagerly awaited the stories and attention of their older siblings. The house itself was designed to accommodate its many residents, with the parents' bedroom on the ground floor and the children's rooms located in the attic space on the second floor. This layout, common for the time, was a detail that would become tragically significant. The home was a place of shared meals, shared laughter, and the unbreakable bonds forged between siblings who were also each other's closest friends. The Sodders were, by all accounts, a close-knit and loving family unit. They were a familiar sight in Fayetteville, whether attending church or simply going about their daily lives. The children were well known at their school and within the neighborhood. They were seen as a single, cohesive entity, the Sodder kids. This strong sense of family identity and mutual reliance was the bedrock of their existence. It was this deep, abiding love for one another that made the events of Christmas Eve 1945 so utterly devastating, and it was this same love that would fuel their parents' desperate, unending search for answers in the dark years that followed. Despite the outward appearance of a happy, thriving family, unsettling undercurrents had begun to surface in the months leading up to the fire. George Sodder's vocal criticisms of Italy's fascist regime had not gone unnoticed, and he had been the target of heated arguments and thinly veiled threats from other members of the local Italian community who held opposing views. These were not casual disagreements. They were intense confrontations that left a lingering sense of unease. George, being a proud and stubborn man, largely dismissed them, but the animosity was real and palpable, casting a subtle but persistent shadow over his family's life. One particularly disturbing incident stood out in the family's memory. A few months before the fire, a stranger had come to the Sodder home looking for work. He walked to the back of the house and pointed to the fuse boxes, warning George that they were faulty and would one day cause a fire. George, who had recently had the house rewired and inspected when they installed a new electric stove, found the man's comment odd and dismissed him. Around the same time, another man, a traveling life insurance salesman, tried to sell George a policy. When George refused, the salesman became irate, ominously warning him, "Your goddamn house is going up in smoke and your children are going to be destroyed." The threats were not just verbal. The Sodder children themselves had experienced strange and frightening encounters. The older children reported that, on several occasions in the weeks before the fire, they had noticed a strange car parked along the main highway. The occupants would sit for long periods, intently watching the younger children as they played in the schoolyard or walked home. This surveillance was so persistent that it made the children uncomfortable, a feeling of being watched by unseen, malevolent eyes. These incidents, initially dismissed as peculiarities, would later be pieced together into a chilling mosaic of premeditated malice. Perhaps the most direct threat came just a short time before the tragic night. George was approached by another man who tried to extort him for business, but George rebuffed him. The man's parting words were laced with a specific and terrifying threat, referencing George's anti-Mussolini sentiments. He sneered that George would be made to pay for his dirty remarks about the dictator. In hindsight, these events seemed like a slow, deliberate countdown to disaster. The Sodder family's world, once a safe haven, was being systematically encroached upon by a growing sense of menace, a gathering storm that was about to break with unimaginable fury. Fayetteville, West Virginia in the 1940s was a town defined by coal mining and the close-knit, often insular communities that grew up around the industry. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business and where family lineage and local loyalties ran deep. The town was nestled in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, a landscape that was both beautiful and honestly pretty isolating. For many it was a place of opportunity, but it was also a place where disputes could fester and where outsiders or those who held unpopular opinions could easily find themselves on the fringes of society. The Sodder family, despite their business success, navigated this complex social world. The town's Italian-American community was a significant part of its social fabric. It provided a network of support and shared culture for immigrants like George and Jennie Sodder. However, it was also a community divided by the politics of their homeland. The rise of Benito Mussolini had created deep fissures with passions running high on both sides. George Sodder's vocal opposition to the fascist leader placed him in a contentious position. In a small town where conformity was often valued, his outspokenness made him a target for criticism and animosity, creating tensions that simmered just beneath the surface of daily life and would later be suspected as a motive for revenge. The local law enforcement and fire services in a town like Fayetteville were modest and often under-resourced. The fire department was composed entirely of volunteers, and its chief, F.J. Morris, was the town's fire chief by day and a dry cleaner by trade. This lack of professional full-time emergency services would prove to be a critical factor on the night of the fire. The delayed response time and the subsequent handling of the investigation were plagued by what seemed to be a combination of incompetence and a puzzling lack of curiosity, which further fueled the Sodders' suspicions that something was deeply wrong with the official story. This small-town environment became both a blessing and a curse for the Sodder family in the aftermath of the tragedy. While the community initially rallied around them with sympathy and support, the official narrative of a tragic accident soon solidified. As George and Jennie began to push back, questioning the authorities and conducting their own investigation, they risked alienating themselves. They were challenging the conclusions of the very people they lived amongst: the fire chief, the police, the coroner. In doing so, they moved from being victims of a tragedy to being thorns in the side of the local establishment, a position that would isolate them in their decades-long, heartbreaking search for the truth. The evening of December 24th, 1945, began with the warm, comforting rituals of a family Christmas Eve. Inside the Sodder home, the air was thick with anticipation and the scent of holiday baking. Jennie Sodder had spent the day preparing for the festive meal, her children a whirlwind of excitement around her. The younger ones, their eyes wide with the magic of the night, had already been tucked into their beds in the attic rooms, their dreams surely filled with visions of Santa Claus and the presents that awaited them in the morning. For the older children, however, the night was still young, and they were eager to savor every moment of the holiday freedom. Marion, the eldest daughter at home, had returned from her job at a dime store in downtown Fayetteville, bearing gifts for her younger siblings. She had bought them new toys, and their excitement was palpable. Morris, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty gathered around her, their faces alight with joy. They pleaded with their mother, Jennie, to let them stay up a little later than usual. They wanted to play with their new treasures, to bask in the special glow of Christmas Eve just a bit longer. Seeing their happy faces and feeling the festive spirit herself, Jennie relented. She agreed they could stay up, a small concession that would haunt her for the rest of her life. As she prepared to retire for the night, Jennie gave her children their final instructions. She reminded them of their chores, tasks that were part of their daily routine but were especially important before they went to sleep. They were to remember to feed the cows and close the doors to the chicken coop before they finally turned in. With these maternal reminders, she went to her own bedroom on the ground floor, leaving the older children to their games and laughter. The last sounds she heard from them were not of distress or fear, but of pure childhood joy, their voices echoing through the house in the peaceful quiet of the late evening. This decision, born of love and holiday indulgence, would become an unbearable point of reflection in the years to come. It was a simple, kind gesture from a mother to her children, allowing them a rare late night to celebrate. No one could have possibly imagined that this act of kindness would place them in the path of an unspeakable tragedy. The image of her children, alive and happy, playing together in the living room, was the last memory Jennie Sodder would ever have of them. It was a moment of perfect family bliss, frozen in time just before the world collapsed into fire and ash. The quiet of the Sodder household was first broken shortly after midnight. The telephone, mounted on the wall in the hall, rang sharply, piercing the silence of the sleeping home. Jennie, roused from her sleep, answered it. On the other end of the line was a woman whose voice she did not recognize. The caller asked for a man whose name was unfamiliar to Jennie. She could hear the clinking of glasses and loud laughter in the background, as if the call was being made from a raucous party or a busy tavern. Jennie told the woman she had reached the wrong number and hung up, dismissing the strange call as a simple mistake, a common enough occurrence. She returned to bed, but the brief disturbance had unsettled the deep sleep of a tired mother. Not long after she had drifted off again, she was awakened by another strange sound. This time it came from above. She heard a loud, distinct thud on the roof of the house, as if something heavy had been dropped or thrown onto it. The thud was immediately followed by a rolling noise, like an object tumbling down the shingles. Jennie sat up, listening intently, but the sound was not repeated. The house fell silent once more. Unsure of what to make of it, she eventually convinced herself it was nothing and lay back down, trying to find her way back to sleep. The final, terrifying awakening came around 1:30 in the morning. This time it wasn't a sound that pulled Jennie from her slumber, but a smell. A thick, acrid odour was wafting into her bedroom. It was the unmistakable smell of smoke. Her heart pounding, she realised with a jolt of terror that the strange sounds and the odd phone call were not isolated incidents, but harbingers of a disaster. She discovered that the room George used as his office, located near their bedroom on the ground floor, was on fire. The flames were already climbing the walls, greedily consuming the wooden structure of their home. Panic erupted. Jennie screamed for George, and together they began a frantic effort to wake the rest of the household. The fire was spreading with terrifying speed, blocking the main staircase that led to the children's attic bedrooms. George and Jennie, along with their children, Marion, Sylvia, John and George Jr., who all slept on the ground floor or in accessible rooms, scrambled out of the house into the freezing night air. But as they stood shivering in the snow, a horrifying realization dawned on them. 5 of their children, Morris, Martha, Louis, Jennie and Betty, were still inside, trapped on the second floor with the fire raging below them. Once outside, the sheer horror of the situation became terrifyingly clear. The house was being consumed by a violent inferno, flames leaping from the windows and licking at the night sky. The joyous sounds of Christmas Eve had been replaced by the roar of the fire and the frantic, desperate screams of the family. George Sodder's first instinct was to rescue his children. He knew the staircase was impassable, a blazing column of fire that made entry through the front of the house impossible. He raced to the side of the home, his mind fixed on his heavy-duty ladder, the one he always kept propped against the exterior wall for just such an emergency. But in the flickering, chaotic light of the fire, George made a chilling discovery. The ladder was gone. It was not in its usual spot. It was not leaning against the house, nor was it lying on the ground nearby. It had vanished. He and his older sons searched frantically in the darkness, their calls growing more desperate as precious seconds ticked by. The ladder, a simple tool that now represented their only hope of reaching the attic windows, was nowhere to be found. It was later discovered thrown into a ditch, some 75 feet away from the house, a detail that was impossible to explain as a mere accident or oversight. Blocked by the missing ladder, George scrambled for another plan. His mind raced, seizing on the two large coal trucks he used for his business. They were parked nearby. If he could just drive one up to the side of the house, he could climb onto its roof and reach the children's windows. He jumped into the cab of the first truck and turned the key. Nothing. The engine wouldn't turn over. He tried again and again, but the truck remained stubbornly silent. He scrambled to the second truck, his heart sinking with each passing moment. It too was dead, refusing to start. Both trucks had been in perfect working order just the day before. Every avenue of rescue seemed to be mysteriously and systematically blocked. As a last resort, the family tried to use water to fight back the flames. They had several large barrels of water on the property for just such a purpose. But when they rushed to them, they found the water inside frozen solid. The December night was cold, but it had not been cold enough for the water in the deep barrels to freeze completely through. It was yet another inexplicable obstacle in a chain of maddening frustrations. They were helpless, forced to stand by and watch in agony as the fire consumed their home, and with it, any hope of reaching their trapped children. While the Sodders fought their desperate and failing battle against the fire, neighbours began to see the terrible glow in the sky. One neighbour, seeing the flames, tried to call the Fayetteville Fire Department but could not get a connection on the telephone line. Another neighbour who lived nearby also saw the blaze but did not call for help, later claiming she assumed someone else had already done so. It fell to one of the Sodder daughters, Marion, to run to a neighbour's house to make the call. She finally got through, but the response was anything but swift. The strange sequence of events that had thwarted the family's rescue attempts now seemed to extend to the official response. The Fayetteville Fire Department was, at the time, a small all-volunteer organisation. The fire chief, F.J. Morris, explained that the call came in late and that he was unable to drive the town's fire truck because he did not know how. A frantic search for a qualified driver began, a delay that cost invaluable time, while the Sodder house burned to the ground. This official explanation for the delay was baffling. In a small town, it seemed incredible that the fire chief himself could not operate the single most important piece of equipment at his disposal. The precious minutes stretched into hours as the fire raged unchecked. By the time the firefighters finally arrived at the scene, there was very little left for them to do. The Sodder family home, a large two-story structure that had stood for years, had been reduced to a smouldering pile of ash and rubble in a mere 45 minutes. The intensity and speed of the blaze was shocking. The roof had collapsed, and the entire structure had fallen in on itself, leaving only the smoking foundation and basement. The firefighters could only douse the remaining embers. For the Sodder family, the late arrival was the final crushing blow. Their home was gone, and hope was fading into the cold grey light of dawn. The fight to save the children had been lost. George and Jennie Sodder, along with their surviving children, could only stand in the snow, wrapped in a state of profound shock and grief, staring at the ruin of their lives. The night that had begun with such joy and celebration had ended in the most horrific way imaginable. The fire had taken everything, their home, their possessions, and they were told 5 of their beloved children. But as the sun rose on Christmas morning, shining down on the devastating scene, the family's grief was already beginning to mix with a deep and unsettling sense of disbelief. In the cold, grim light of Christmas Day, the official search for the children's remains began. Fire Chief F.J. Morris and his small crew conducted a perfunctory search through the debris in the basement of the burned-out home. After a brief and superficial effort, they delivered a stunning conclusion. They had found no bones, no skulls, not a single trace of any of the 5 children who were presumed to have been inside. The chief's explanation was that the fire must have been so intensely hot that it had completely cremated the bodies, leaving nothing behind. This explanation was offered as fact, and a death certificate for each of the 5 children was issued just days later. For George and Jennie Sodder, this explanation was not just unsatisfactory, it was impossible to believe. George, a practical man who understood the physical world through his work, could not accept that a house fire, however intense, could utterly obliterate 5 human skeletons. His doubt was reinforced when he spoke to an employee at a local crematorium. The expert confirmed his suspicions, stating that human bones are surprisingly resilient and would certainly have remained even after a 2-hour cremation at 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. The Sodder house fire had burned for less than an hour, making the complete disappearance of 5 bodies highly improbable. The family's doubt was further compounded by other strange discoveries in the fire's aftermath. A telephone repairman, called to inspect the lines, informed George that the phone had not failed because the line had burned through. Instead, he found that the line had been deliberately cut high up on the pole, a feat that would have required someone to climb it. This discovery, combined with the missing ladder, the stalled trucks and the frozen water barrels, painted a picture not of a tragic accident, but of a carefully planned and executed act of sabotage designed to ensure the fire was as destructive as possible and that no rescue could succeed. The official investigation was closed almost as quickly as it had opened, with the cause of the fire listed as faulty wiring. This conclusion was reached despite George having had the entire house professionally rewired and inspected just months earlier. The coroner's inquest, held on December 30th, declared the deaths accidental. But for the Sodders, the case was far from closed. The lack of remains, the series of inexplicable obstacles, and the cursory nature of the official investigation all pointed to a darker truth. They began to believe that the fire was a diversion, a cover for the abduction of their children. This belief would launch them on a lifelong, heartbreaking quest for answers. In the days following the fire, the town of Fayetteville wrapped the Sodder family in a blanket of communal grief. Sympathy was offered freely, and the official narrative of a tragic accident was accepted by most as the sad final chapter of the story. But George Sodder couldn't find peace. The official explanation grated against his practical mind and his father's intuition. The absence of any physical evidence of his children was a massive, gaping hole in the story, one that no official report could fill. He could not mourn children whose deaths felt so abstract, so unproven. His grief was overshadowed by a persistent, gnawing doubt that soon grew into a powerful conviction. He began to question everything about that night. The fire chief's claim that the blaze was hot enough to completely destroy all 5 bodies felt fundamentally wrong. George knew from his work with coal and incinerators that fire, even at high temperatures, leaves behind evidence, especially bone. The idea that 5 skeletons could simply vanish into ash and smoke seemed like a fantasy, a convenient explanation to close a difficult case. This single, irrefutable point became the cornerstone of his disbelief. He refused to accept the death certificates that had been issued so hastily, viewing them not as proof of loss, but as part of a premature and deeply flawed conclusion. To settle his mind, George took matters into his own hands. He sought out an expert, an employee from a crematorium, and posed a direct question. He asked if it was possible for a house fire to completely destroy human bones. The answer he received confirmed his deepest suspicions. The crematorium worker was unequivocal. No, it was not possible. He explained that even after hours of exposure to temperatures far exceeding those of a typical house fire, bones would remain. This expert opinion solidified George's resolve. The official story was not just unlikely, it was a lie. Something else had happened to his children. This realization transformed George Sodder from a grieving father into a determined investigator. He could no longer passively accept the condolences of his neighbors or the dismissive reports of the local authorities. He had a new purpose, a mission that would consume the rest of his life. He would find the truth. He would prove that his children had not died in that fire. He believed with every fiber of his being that they had been taken. and he vowed that he would never stop searching for them, no matter the cost, the time, or the opposition he might face along the way. With the official investigation closed and the authorities unwilling to reconsider the case, George and Jennie Sodder knew they were on their own. They began their own meticulous, painstaking investigation, revisiting every detail of the fire and the events leading up to it. They started at the site of their ruined home. Unwilling to rebuild on what they considered a crime scene, George preserved the site. He brought in a bulldozer and carefully pushed tons of dirt over the basement, intending to create a memorial garden. But this act was also a way of securing the area, protecting any potential evidence that the authorities might have missed in their cursory search. Their quest for answers soon led them to hire a private investigator, a man named C.C. Tinsley. Tinsley began by digging into the strange characters who had appeared in the Sodders' lives before the fire. He learned that the insurance salesman who had threatened George was, in fact, a member of the coroner's jury that had ruled the fire an accident. This was a shocking conflict of interest, a discovery that suggested the official verdict was tainted from the start. It hinted at a local conspiracy, a deliberate effort to cover up the truth and silence the family's questions before they could even be properly asked. Tinsley also looked into the fire chief, F.J. Morris, whose behaviour had been perplexing from the beginning. Tinsley uncovered a bizarre story. A local bus driver told him that he had seen Morris at the fire scene but not fighting the blaze. Instead, he claimed to have found a small bundle of what looked like engine parts, which he believed Morris had removed from the scene. Years later, Morris himself would confess to a stunning lie. He admitted that he had found a human heart in the ashes. He claimed he had secretly buried it in a dynamite box, wanting to spare the family more pain. This strange confession only deepened the mystery. The Sodders, driven by Tinsley's findings and their own suspicions, decided to take a drastic step. In 1949, 4 years after the fire, George excavated the entire site of his former home. With the help of his sons, he sifted through every inch of the dirt and debris that filled the basement. The search was slow and emotionally draining. They found a few small objects that had somehow survived the blaze, coins, a dictionary, fragments of the roof. But of the 5 children who were supposed to have died there, they found nothing. No bones, no teeth, no skulls. The complete absence of human remains was to them the ultimate proof. As the Sodders dug deeper, a disturbing pattern of strange occurrences and sightings began to emerge, suggesting their children might have survived. A woman who operated a tourist stop between Fayetteville and Charleston contacted them. She claimed she had seen the children herself in the days immediately following the fire. She recalled serving them breakfast at her establishment early one morning. She said they had arrived in a car with Florida license plates, accompanied by 2 men and 2 women who all appeared to be of Italian extraction. The woman said the adults acted suspiciously, refusing to let the children out of their sight. This was not an isolated report. Another woman who worked at a hotel in Charleston, about 50 miles away, came forward with a similar story. She told the Sodders she had seen 4 of the 5 missing children about a week after the fire. She remembered them distinctly because the group accompanying them was so unusual. The 2 men and 2 women spoke Italian and were aggressive, preventing her from speaking to the children. She tried to be friendly, but the adults quickly shut down any interaction. Her account, combined with the first sighting, began to paint a picture of children being held against their will, spirited away from Fayetteville. The leads were not confined to West Virginia. A woman in St. Louis, Missouri, wrote to the Sodders, claiming that Martha, their 12-year-old daughter, was living in a convent there. The family followed up on this lead, but it ultimately led nowhere. Another tip came from a relative of Jennie's in Florida, who reported seeing a boy that strongly resembled Morris Sodder. Then a patron at a bar in Texas told a disturbing story of overhearing two men bragging about a fire that had been set in West Virginia on Christmas Eve some years prior, a conversation that sent a chill down the family's spine. Each tip, each potential sighting, was a roller coaster of hope and crushing disappointment. George traveled thousands of miles, chasing down every lead, no matter how tenuous. He journeyed to Texas, to St. Louis, to Florida, showing his children's pictures to anyone who would listen. While none of these leads resulted in a reunion, they reinforced the family's belief that their children were alive somewhere. The sheer number of independent reports, many with similar details, suggested that something more than a simple fire had occurred. It pointed towards a conspiracy, a kidnapping that had been carefully planned and executed. The investigation took another dramatic turn when George Sodder saw a photograph in a New York City newspaper. The picture showed a group of young ballet dancers, and one of the girls bore a striking resemblance to his missing daughter, Betty. Convinced it was her, George immediately got into his car and drove all the way to New York City to find the school where the photograph had been taken. He was desperate for a face-to-face meeting, just to see for himself if this young dancer was the little girl he had lost years before. The journey was filled with a fragile, desperate hope that this could be the breakthrough he had prayed for. When he arrived at the school, his heart was pounding. He explained his story and showed the photograph to the school officials. However, his hopes were quickly dashed. The parents of the girl in the photograph were contacted and, they refused to allow George to meet her. They would not permit him to see her or speak with her, denying him the chance to confirm or deny the resemblance for himself. The refusal was abrupt and final, leaving George with no recourse. He was forced to drive all the way back to West Virginia, the long miles filled with frustration and the bitter taste of another dead end. This incident, however, did not entirely extinguish the family's hope. The refusal of the parents to allow a simple meeting seemed strange to George. If they were certain the girl was their daughter, why not grant a grieving father a moment of their time to put his mind at ease? Their defensiveness felt suspicious, and it fueled his belief that powerful forces might be at work, actively trying to keep him from finding his children. He wondered if the family had been threatened or paid off to deny him access. Another piece in the puzzle of a widespread cover-up that seemed determined to thwart him at every turn. Back in Fayetteville, the story of George's trip to New York spread through the community, further cementing the local legend of the family's relentless search. It became another chapter in their tragic story, a testament to a father's unwavering love and his refusal to give up. While it did not bring Betty home, the incident strengthened the family's conviction that their children were not just alive, but were being hidden from them. It was proof that their search was getting close to something, and it renewed their determination to continue, no matter how many doors were slammed in their faces. By 1952, 7 years after the fire, the trail had grown cold. The initial flurry of sightings had dwindled, and the private investigator had exhausted all his leads. But George and Jennie Sodder refused to let the memory of their children fade. They refused to let the world forget. In a bold and heartbreaking move, they decided to make their search a permanent and public fixture. They erected a large billboard along Route 16, a major highway that passed near their Fayetteville home. The billboard featured large, smiling portraits of their 5 missing children: Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty. Beneath the portraits, the billboard told the story of the fire in stark, simple terms and offered a substantial reward for information leading to the children's recovery. The initial reward was $5,000, a huge sum of money for the time, and it was later doubled to $10,000. The billboard was a constant, unavoidable reminder of the unsolved mystery that haunted the town. For every person who drove that highway, the faces of the 5 children stared out, their smiles a stark contrast to the dark story of their disappearance. It was a public plea, a cry for help etched onto the landscape itself. The billboard became a local landmark, a symbol of the family's undying hope and their unyielding quest for justice. It stood for nearly 40 years, a silent testament to a parent's love and the anguish of not knowing. The paint faded and peeled over the years. The weather wore down the wood, but the message remained clear. The Sodder family was still waiting, still searching. The billboard ensured that the case was never truly forgotten, keeping the story alive for a new generation and attracting national attention to the small West Virginia town and its enduring mystery. While the billboard generated countless tips over the decades, none ever led to a definitive answer. It brought forth a stream of psychics, con artists, and well-meaning individuals with vague stories, but the core mystery remained unsolved. George Sodder personally investigated every single lead that came in as a result of the billboard, traveling across the country to follow even the faintest glimmer of hope. The billboard was more than just an advertisement for a reward. It was the physical manifestation of George and Jennie's promise to their children that they would never, ever give up looking for them. One of the most persistent and compelling theories behind the disappearance of the Sodder children involves the Sicilian Mafia. George Sodder, as an outspoken Italian immigrant, had made his anti-Mussolini sentiments well known within his community. In the post-war era, this was a dangerous stance to take, especially in areas with close-knit immigrant populations where loyalties to the old country and its political figures ran deep. It is believed that George's trucking business may have attracted the attention of local organized crime figures who attempted to recruit him or extort money from him. His proud and stubborn refusal to cooperate would have been seen as a grave insult, an act of defiance that, in their world, could not go unpunished. The threats George received prior to the fire lend significant weight to this theory. The insurance salesman who warned that his house would go up in smoke and his children would be destroyed was not making an idle threat. It was a classic intimidation tactic, a prelude to violent retribution. The other men who lurked around his property watching his children, and the one who explicitly referenced George's dirty remarks about Mussolini, all fit the pattern of organized crime pressure tactics. The fire, in this scenario, was not about killing the children, but about destroying George's life and making an example of him. The kidnapping would have been the ultimate punishment, taking from him the very thing he held most dear. The methodical nature of the crime also points towards a well-organized operation. The cutting of the phone lines, the disappearance of the ladder, and the disabling of both of George's trucks all suggest a coordinated effort by multiple people. This was not the work of a lone, disgruntled individual. It was a planned attack, executed with precision to ensure maximum devastation and to prevent any chance of rescue. The subsequent sightings of the children in the company of Italian-speaking adults in a car with Florida license plates further support this theory. Florida was a known hub for mafia activity, and it is plausible the children were spirited away and transported there, far from the reach of West Virginia law enforcement. Furthermore, the apparent complicity or incompetence of local officials could also be explained by mafia influence. The bizarre behavior of the fire chief, the shocking conflict of interest with the coroner's jury, and the overall lack of a thorough investigation could suggest that key officials were either intimidated or paid off to look the other way. In a small town, it would not have been difficult for a powerful criminal element to exert control over local authorities, ensuring that the official story of an accidental fire was quickly established and never seriously challenged. The Sodder children, in this terrifying scenario, became silent victims of a hidden war, their lives stolen as collateral in their father's conflict with a powerful and ruthless enemy. While the mafia theory is, pretty compelling, there's also another possibility to consider, that the crime was actually more personal, rooted in a local dispute or maybe even a deep-seated grudge. Fayetteville was a small town, and in places like that, personal conflicts could fester and sometimes sadly escalate into acts of extreme violence. George Sodder, by his own admission, was a man of strong opinions, and honestly, he wasn't afraid to get into heated arguments. It's possible that he made a bitter enemy closer to home, someone whose desire for revenge went far beyond just disagreements over politics or business. This theory suggests that the fire and kidnapping were the result of a personal vendetta, an act of intimate, calculated cruelty meant to inflict the maximum possible pain on George and his family. The perpetrator, if you think about it, could have been someone known to the family, someone who was familiar with their routines, their property, and the layout of their house. This person would have known exactly where George kept his ladder, which trucks he drove, and how to disable them effectively. They would have known that the children slept in the attic, making them especially vulnerable. The act of stealing the children, rather than just leaving them to perish in the fire, suggests a particularly twisted motive. It wasn't enough to kill them. The perpetrator wanted the Sodders to live with the agony of uncertainty, to suffer for the rest of their lives with the torment of not knowing their children's fate. This theory could also explain that strange phone call Jennie received just before the fire broke out. The caller, a woman asking for an unfamiliar name with a bunch of party noises in the background, could have been a deliberate distraction. It might have been a way to make sure someone in the house was awake and would soon discover the fire, but only after it was too late to save everyone. It could have even been a cruel taunt from an accomplice, a way for the perpetrators to listen in on the first moments of the chaos they had created. This level of psychological torment, honestly, points away from a professional, businesslike crime and more towards something deeply personal and hateful. The lack of a ransom demand also supports the idea of a revenge motive rather than a financially motivated kidnapping. If the children were taken for money, the kidnappers would have eventually made contact to state their price. But no such demand ever came. The goal here wasn't profit, it was suffering. Someone in or around Fayetteville hated George Sodder enough to orchestrate this horrific event, to burn his house to the ground and steal 5 of his children from their beds. They then simply vanished, content to watch from the shadows as the family they destroyed tore itself apart in a desperate, unending search for answers that were never meant to be found. One theory suggests the children escaped the fire, fleeing into the night, terrified and disoriented. Perhaps found by strangers, they may have started new lives, their memories fading or suppressed, never realizing the world was searching for them. Yet the odds of 5 children vanishing without a trace, never reaching out and remaining hidden for decades, seem almost as unlikely as any kidnapping plot. Another theory claims the children were abducted and sold through black market adoptions, their identities erased. The fire and the fire chief's bizarre actions may have been part of a cover-up to ensure no one searched for them. Raised in new families, the children could have grown up unaware of their true origins. This would explain their silence, but leaves the family's heartbreak and the mystery unresolved. Decades later, Jennie Sodder received a photo of a young man resembling her missing son, Louis, with a cryptic message on the back. The family's hopes reignited, but the private investigator they hired vanished and the letter's origins were never traced. Was it a genuine sign or a cruel hoax? The truth remains elusive. The photo endures as the most haunting clue in the Sodder case. For 40 years, the Sodder family's billboard stood as a symbol of hope and defiance, keeping the children's faces and the mystery alive. Maintained by George and later updated with the mysterious photo, it drew national attention and became a landmark. When it finally came down after Jennie's death, it marked the end of a public vigil, but not the end of the questions. The image of those 5 faces remains etched in true crime history. The Sodder case left Fayetteville forever changed, dividing the community and fueling decades of speculation. The story became local legend, a cautionary tale and a source of unease about what really happened that night. Today, the mystery draws new generations of sleuths, keeping the town's secrets alive. The disappearance of the Sodder children remains Fayetteville's enduring enigma. For the Sodder family, the fire of 1945 was not a single event, but the beginning of a lifetime of torment. George Sodder dedicated the rest of his existence to the search for his missing children. He traveled thousands of miles, spent thousands of dollars, and followed every lead, no matter how faint. The search consumed him, turning him from a prosperous businessman into a man obsessed by a single, all-encompassing quest. His health suffered under the strain of the constant hope and disappointment. He passed away in 1968, a man broken by a mystery he could not solve, going to his grave convinced that his children were alive and that he had failed to find them. Jennie Sodder lived with her grief for another 2 decades after her husband's death. For the rest of her life, she wore black, a perpetual state of mourning for her lost children. She tended the memorial garden that George had planted at the site of their home, a beautiful and poignant tribute to the lives that had vanished. She never wavered in her belief that the children had been kidnapped, and she never gave up hope that one day she might see them again. The mysterious letter and photograph that arrived in 1967 gave her a renewed, though painful, sense of hope in her final years. She passed away in 1989, her heart forever burdened by unanswered questions. The surviving Sodder children grew up in the long shadow of the tragedy. Their childhood was defined by the absence of their 5 siblings and their parents' all-consuming search. They assisted in the investigations, helped sift through the ashes, and listened to the endless stream of theories and tips. They lived in a home where grief was a constant presence, a palpable entity in every room. The mystery shaped their lives, their relationships, and their own understanding of the world. They inherited their parents' quest, continuing to speak to reporters and investigators long after George and Jennie were gone, determined that their siblings would not be forgotten. The youngest of the surviving children, Sylvia, was only 2 years old on the night of the fire. She has no memory of her lost siblings, only of the lifelong aftermath. She has become the family's primary torchbearer, the last living link to the original tragedy. Now an elderly woman herself, she continues to believe that her siblings were taken and did not die in the fire. She has worked with authors and documentarians to keep the story alive, driven by a need for answers and a sense of duty to her parents and the brothers and sisters she never had the chance to know. The grief of the Sodder family has been passed down through generations, a heavy and unresolved inheritance. As we reflect on the fate of the Sodder children, we are left confronting the profound and terrifying nature of the unknown. The case is a labyrinth with no exit, a series of clues that lead only to more questions. Every theory, from a mafia kidnapping to accidental survival, is riddled with inconsistencies and unproven assumptions. The truth remains tantalizingly out of reach, obscured by the passage of time, the loss of evidence, and the silence of those who may have known what really happened. It is a story with no resolution, a narrative that denies us the comfort of closure, leaving us in a state of perpetual uncertainty. The mystery forces us to confront our deepest fears, the fear of loss, the fear that the systems we trust to protect us can fail, and the fear that some questions may never be answered. The Sodder family's story is a chilling reminder that evil can operate with impunity, leaving behind a trail of devastation and a void of unanswered questions. What happened on that Christmas Eve in 1945? Were the children lost to the flames, their bodies consumed by an unusually intense fire? Or did they vanish into the night, stolen by an unknown enemy for reasons that remain forever shrouded in darkness? The silence that followed the fire is perhaps the most haunting aspect of the entire case. If the children were kidnapped and lived on, why did they never make contact? Was it because of trauma, new identities, or fear? If they were taken by a powerful organization, was the conspiracy so perfect that it could silence 5 children for a lifetime? The absence of any definitive proof, either of their deaths or their survival, is what makes this case so uniquely chilling. The mystery exists in a liminal space between fact and speculation, a historical void that has been filled with theories, but never with truth. Ultimately, the story of the Sodder children endures because it is more than just an unsolved case. It is a profound human tragedy that echoes through time. It is a testament to the boundless love of parents for their children and the agonizing pain of not knowing their fate. As the years turn into decades, the whispers of what happened in Fayetteville, West Virginia, grow fainter, but they do not disappear. They linger in the Appalachian air, a permanent, unsettling reminder that some secrets are kept forever, and some stories are destined to remain shrouded in darkness, their final chapters never to be written.